Who is winning the war in Ukraine? You might be looking at this map and saying that it looks fairly similar to the map you saw during the summer, with the major exception being the east of Kharkiv, of course. But there's actually a lot going on behind the scenes that gives us a clearer picture of what's going on here. So why don't we start with the east of Kharkiv first? What exactly happened here that caused the Russians to withdraw from such a large area? Largely, the issue here was the fact that the Russian generals were pretty incompetent in that they only staffed about a few thousand Russian troops throughout this entire region, with only about 1,000 up on the front line. They didn't have to defend the north as much since the Severodonetsk River blocked the Ukrainians from advancing into Russian territory. That went all the way from the Russian border to the dam here. The same river went all the way around to forming another border between the Russians and Ukrainians at Balyanka, and that went all the way around to near Izumi here and blocked the Ukrainians all the way to Velivka. And that was generally the border between the Russians and Ukrainians, except for between the dam and Balyanka, the front line was essentially just open fields, which is where the Ukrainians took advantage. Here the Ukrainians amassed a large force to attack the Russians, and when they did, the Russians didn't really have anybody out here except for a few guard troops, and they decided to retreat, obviously, as opposed to get killed from a large army advancing on them. And that happened all the way up until the Oskol River here, and it was basically a large tube going along this highway here to Kup'yansk and along the southern highway between Balyanka and Pivysuka. This is when a political decision came in to abandon Izumi and the whole area around it, and the northern part of Kharkiv to the eastern side of the Oskol River. But this was a fairly arbitrary line, as the Russians needed a way to save face from such a major military defeat. So they decided to portray this as a withdrawal from the area as opposed to a defeat. And this had the side effect of dividing the major city of Kup'yansk in half, with the Russians withdrawing from this side of the city, despite being able to hold it, allowing the Ukrainians to entrench themselves on the western end of the city. This allowed them to engage in urban warfare to take the other side of the city pretty easily, allowing them to establish a bridgehead on the other side. The Russians just didn't have enough time to set up defenses in the city, and a similar situation happened down south, where they abandoned Oskol and Borodinichne. This was an even worse situation for the Russians, as they didn't even have a major settlement directly on the other side. So this basically led to the Ukrainians establishing a bridgehead pretty easily, and starting to capture settlement by settlement, until they got past the forest here. The goal for the Ukrainians here was to capture the large city of Lyman, which was only guarded by about 500 militiamen at the time, as the Russians were ordered to retreat to Crimea, but the militia wanted to stay and fight for the city. This essentially led to a large siege that took about a month to break, where the Ukrainians had to go in from the north and the south to try to surround the city to force the militiamen to retreat to Crimea. This eventually happened, and they took the city and conjoined forces with Kup'yansk from the north as they came from the south. Since then, the Russians have been able to stabilize the front along the Zhyberets River here, and the Ukrainians have not been able to make any significant progress for about a month and a half now. It seems the defense at Lyman gave the Russians enough time to set up new defenses along the Crimea-Svoto line here. There have been some back and forths like around down here, where the Russians have attacked these areas along the Zhyberets. Capturing these territories, the Ukrainians fall back, and then they attack, and then the Russians fall back, and then back and forth for a while now. But the Russians have been able to recapture Dubrovia and essentially get control over the forest down here. The Ukrainians' main goal in this area is to capture Svoto, and to do that they can either go in and cut the line between Crimea and Svoto, essentially reducing the amount of resources that can get to the settlement, or they can go in from the north and try to surround the settlement and cut them off that way. But that will be pretty difficult considering they have to get through the Zivorets River, all of these settlements here, the highway, which it has its own defenses, and this doesn't show typography that well, but this is a very hilly area, giving the Russians the high ground. And even if the Ukrainians are able to cut the Svoto-Kremennya line here, the Russians still have a back road to supply Svoto from Kremennya, and they're currently using that line right now. This, along with the fact that the Russians are currently getting more reinforcements in this section, makes it difficult to see how the Ukrainians can move much more forward in this area. In fact, the Ukrainians have been battering their head against a wall in the Kup'yansk area for quite a while now, and their bridgehead at Taivolsanka has not been very successful, and the Russians have actually recaptured territories in this region. So with this battlefield looking pretty static, why don't we look a little south to see how the two sides are doing down here? The front line has been stuck at the Bakhmut-Lysychansk highway here since about July, so they have not really been moving much in this area. The Russians did make an incursion into Severesk, not into the city itself, but in the hills around it. Essentially, the Ukrainians just abandoned the whole settlement, setting up positions around the hills, and planned on bombarding the Russians if they came into it. Obviously, the Russians did not do that and fought them up in the hills. They did not win those battles, so they fell back into Belohorivka, which the Ukrainians also took at some points, but there's some reports that is fighting for that settlement right now. But aside from that, things have been very static on this front for a very long time, and it's largely dependent on what happens south in Soledar and Bakhmut. So looking at Soledar, the Russians have entrenched themselves into the city, but they've been stuck at this large factory and this mine here for quite a while, and have not been able to move much more into the city. They have in the past few weeks been able to capture a few rows of houses here, as well as an absolutely demolished factory that no longer exists. But even if they are able to capture half of this settlement, they'll have to deal with high-rises on the western half, and that's going to be pretty difficult to deal with. So I don't see the Russians taking the city head-on. They'll probably have to wait until they capture Bakhmut to be able to come at the settlement from both ends, and essentially force them out. Which brings us to the main conflict area of Bakhmut. Now you may have heard that the Russians have been fighting for Bakhmut for 3 months now. That's more than a little misleading, as they have had this area for 3 months. Needless to say, that is not exactly fighting for the settlement. That is establishing a forward position near the enemy's defenses so they don't come out of their defensive area and try to attack your defenses. And in those 3 months, the Russians have since captured this entire southern area here. Granted, that is not much for 3 months, but it is a lot more than the Ukrainians are trying to portray. So why has it taken so long for the Russians to capture just a few small villages out here? Well, for one, it is right next to the Donetsk and Luhansk border, which has been established for 8 years, and anything close to that border is going to be fortified to all hell and back. So those defenses took a long time to get past. There's also the fact that the Russians had to capture a major hydroelectric power plant, and industrial areas in general are very fortifiable and difficult to capture. Plus, the Russians much rather not destroy their main water supply, so they had to be careful not to do too much damage to the plant. And once they got past that, the main issue was Kodyma. Now you may be wondering why it took so long to capture a very small, seemingly barren village. Well, the Ukrainians didn't actually occupy much of the village at all. They essentially left the location, set up on these hills up here, and bombarded the Russians every time they got close to the settlement. This was a similar situation up north in Zetseve, so the Russians were essentially blocked on this line. The big thing that changed was that the Ukrainians got a little overconfident when they got major territory in Kharkiv, and then they decided to come down from their perch at Kodyma and try to capture more Russian territory in Semihira. But it did not go too well for them, and the Russians counterattacked and were able to capture the settlement before they were able to set up defensive positions on the hills again. This essentially led to the collapse of the Ukrainians' position in the south of Bakhmut, as they were able to come in to Mykolaievka and Mykolaievka II from both Kodyma and Dotcha. And once they captured these, they went and captured this settlement and attacked Zatseve from the south, west, east, and north. And with this settlement surrounded, the Ukrainians had to retreat to Epitne, and the Russians were able to capture the hills up here, being right next to a captured settlement, so the Ukrainians had to abandon Ivangrad as well, or risk being bombarded from the hills. The Russians then moved into this territory, and now there is fighting between these two settlements and across the river. This brings us to the current situation in Bakhmut. Now, the Russians are obviously not going to take the city head on. Their goal here is to surround the city and force them out. So their next goals here are three main towns: Pererodne, Klishchivka, and these settlements down here. Capturing these towns would just be to clean up the front line, and they would then come in from the north and the south to capture this railway station here. And the Ukrainians would obviously be forced out of this small town as well. This would also give the Russians a direct line, both a highway and a railway, directly to Bakhmut here. But of course they would need to capture Klishchivka first before they could use the railway. The Russians are currently bombarding and attacking the Ukrainian positions at the railway station here, and once the Russians capture this, then they could attack the city directly and come in from the north along the railway. Both of these settlements have been fortified since the Ukrainians were in Kodyma, so it's going to be difficult for the Russians to capture these positions. But with the momentum in the Russians' favor in this sector, I think they will be able to capture them. And once the Russians have this town, they would only be one town away from cutting off one of the main supply lines to Bakhmut. If the Russians are able to capture Ivanivsky here, the Ukrainians will start feeling major pressure because they won't only cut this route, but likely capture this route as well, as there's pretty much nothing guarding it, which would leave the Ukrainians with only one route in and out of the city. And the Russians will likely be trying to capture Pererodne at the same time as capturing the southern settlements, and if they're able to do that, they could possibly put the main road under fire control, where they can bombard the road with artillery, making it very difficult to move anything through. At this point, the Russians will start making incursions directly into the city on all sides to put pressure on the Ukrainians to retreat from the city. But since Bakhmut is such an important city for both sides, the Ukrainians might just bunker down in the city and try to hold out for as long as they can. But with supply lines cut on all sides, they wouldn't last too long, and the Russians will eventually capture the city. This would obviously be disastrous for the Ukrainians because it would lead to the complete collapse of the Bakhmut-Siversk line, as the Russians would come up from behind and capture Soledar, and then capture the settlements south of Siversk. They would then likely meet up with troops from the north who would attack the hills north of the settlement. At this point, the front line will likely move somewhere in between these two major lines, perhaps along this artificial river that acts as a water supply, though the Ukrainians will likely want to keep control of Mykolaievka here, as it's so close to Slavyansk. The Russians would likely also push on laymen at this point to round out their front line. But they wouldn't move much beyond this point just yet, as they still have some major obstacles to the south, in Chasov Yar and Avdiivka. The goal is to come at the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk line from both directions, and Chasov Yar is on top of a major hill, so they could easily bombard anyone who comes near it. This will make it very difficult for the Russians to capture this point, so they will likely go for a larger encirclement to keep clear of their fire range. But even with this settlement captured, they still wouldn't want to move in on this line just yet, as you would be sandwiching yourself between two major cities which is generally not advisable unless you're coming at it from both directions. So why don't we move on to their southern positions that they plan to move up from? The Russians' main goal here is Avdiivka, which, being such a large city right next to the Donetsk-Luhansk border, it has been fortified very heavily for 8 years now, so the Russians are not going to capture it head-on. Their plan again is to encircle the settlement from both directions, and they have already done most of that on the east side of the city, so they are now working on the west, coming up from the south. Just in the past few days, the Russians have been able to entrench themselves on the outskirts of Opytne and Vodane. Opytne is not that vital to the Russians as it doesn't have any major roads to the settlements to the north. It would give them access to attack Avdiivka directly from the south, but they don't plan on doing that until they fully encircle the settlement. So the more significant of the two is Vodane here, because if the Russians are able to capture this, that gives them access to start attacking these smaller settlements and start to surround Avdiivka from the west. With Avdiivka surrounded, the Ukrainians will be forced to retreat, and the Russians will be able to move on from this city to Achertine, and from here there's only small towns in their way going up north to meet up with their troops from Chasiv Yar to start to surround the cities of Torske and New York, and that would force the Ukrainians to retreat to the next major city along the line. The Russians would then repeat this strategy with each major city along the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk line, cutting off each city, so the Ukrainians have to retreat further north until they get to the two main cities. If the Russians are able to get to here, this will be the final major battle of the Donbass, and the Russians will essentially go in to cut off each of the major supply routes into the city. But it will be pretty difficult to actually capture the two cities without having control of Izium, as the Ukrainians would have a large staging ground to attack the Russians in the rear to try to break the siege of Slavyansk from the north. So the Russians will have to capture Izium at some point in between all of these actions. And this brings us to their possible attack in Kharkiv, as the British intelligence MI6 has warned that the Russians are amassing troops up here to attack the Ukrainians all the way down to Izium, trying to trap the bulk of their main forces in between those troops and their troops in Luhansk. If the Russians attempt this, they will likely try to re-establish the front line between Balyanka and the Severodonetsk dam here. The Ukrainians trapped in between would likely try to retreat down to Izium to prevent the Russians from capturing the city, while also preventing themselves from getting smashed between the two armies. If the Russians are able to take Izium, that will essentially lead to the complete encirclement of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And if the Russians capture Slavyansk, that will essentially be the end of the war in the Donbass. There will of course be cleanup operations out here, but they are largely small towns in comparison to the major defenses of this large city line here. Of course, this is a lot of speculation, but I did want to illustrate the Russians' general plan to win the war in the Donbass. It also shows how the capture of small towns can lead to the capture of larger towns, and then larger cities, and then entire sections of the battlefield. But even if the Russians are able to do this, it will take them a long time to do so. So why don't we look at the next front down south? This is where the cleanup operations will happen in Donetsk, either in conjunction with or after the Battle of Slavyansk. But the Russians are already making some progress here. Like in Pervomavsky, they have taken some parts of the settlement, and with Vodane captured, they can attack the settlement from the north and essentially behind. Capturing this town along with this one directly after, the Russians would be able to dislodge the Ukrainians from their fortified positions in Novelvsky, and that would enable the Russians to attack Krasnohorivka from the north, as well as taking it head-on from the east. And considering how fortified this city is, the Russians will likely want to capture Mariinka before they move in on Krasnohorivka. And the Russians have started to make more progress in Mariinka. Just in the past few days, they have captured these few blocks as well as this boarding school here. But this city has been fortified for 8 years, given that it's right on the border with Donetsk, so this has been a very slow grind for the Russians, and they much rather prefer to just bypass the defenses of the city by surrounding it and cutting off their main supply routes. They have recently captured this outpost near their northern road, and they are working on the southern road down south in this sector. In the past few days, the Russians have started a major assault along this entire line. They originally got about halfway through the city, but then reinforcements came from the Ukrainians and they pushed them out to the outskirts here. And further north, they have started to attack this city here, with the Russians setting up artillery along this major hill and bombarding them from the high ground. The reports as of this recording say they are in the outskirts of this town, but things are changing very quickly. They are also pushing in the fields down south in between these two major fronts towards Vodane and Vodane, trying to cut the road supplying Volgodar from the north. This is the Russians' main goal in this area, as it is heavily fortified and mostly made up of high-rises, giving them a major advantage for anyone who comes at them. This is why the Russians are again trying to cut off resources for them by cutting the road in the north, and they tried in the south here. They are trying to still capture this city as of this recording, but they have also tried to attack this town out here. It's a fairly dynamic situation in this front, but if they are able to capture this road, they will pretty easily be able to capture Marinka by surrounding it. They'll likely also try to capture the other half of the city that has been stuck in between these two sides for a long time now. Even though they would have the eastern road, they would still have to cut off the road to the north and to the northeast. After the capture of that settlement and Krasnohorivka, it will essentially move the entire line to here. The Russians would then head further north until they capture Pokrovsky, and that is essentially their plan for the southern part of Donetsk. There's not really much happening on the rest of the front. In Zaporizhia, basically what's happening is the Ukrainians are building up forces for an assault into Russian territory, and the Russians are building up forces to defend against them. The main goals for the Ukrainians are to capture Tokmak and to make their way all the way down to the Sea of Azov, cutting the land bridge in between Crimea and Russia. But given just how many Russian troops are stationed here, I find it unlikely the Ukrainians will be able to make that major of gains. They might make some incursions into Russian territory, but not all the way to the Sea of Azov. They also risk a major Russian counterattack if they attack in this sector, because this line has been pretty static for most of the war at this point. And if the Russians were to attack or counterattack in this sector, their main goals would be Orkhiv, Haliopol, and Novomykhailivka. That would give them 3 of the major roads coming into and out of Zaporizhia. But I don't expect an assault on the city itself anytime soon. That would likely require the Russians to come up from the other side of the Dnipro River as well. So now we move on to the final front in Kherson and Mykolaiv. This sector has been pretty static as well, but a few months ago the Ukrainians did make an incursion into the left half of the Dnipro River here, and the Russians just decided to withdraw from the northern part of Kherson to round out their front line. But since then, the line has stabilized to about here. That has not really moved at all for 2 months now. The main news in this area right now is that the Ukrainians are supposedly building up for a major attack on Kherson. There are reports that there are about 70,000 Ukrainian troops in Mykolaiv, and in response, the Russians are evacuating civilians from Kherson city itself. The Russians say they are doing this because they believe the Ukrainians are planning on blowing up the dam in the Dnipro River, and that would lead to all of the green area here being flooded. Immediately after alleging this, the Ukrainians alleged that the Russians were planning on blowing it up. Now, obviously, the Russians have no incentive to do that because that would trap the Russian troops on the western side of the Dnipro River, while making resupply practically impossible. The Ukrainians then said it is to cover their retreat from Kherson, but they are not retreating from Kherson, they are actually reinforcing the Kherson area on the western side of the river. In fact, the Ukrainian government has already acknowledged this, saying they believe that the Russians are feigning weakness in this area to lure the Ukrainians into attacking them. Now you might ask, why would the Russians want to lure in an attack as opposed to just attack themselves? Well, it's believed their strategy here is to create another Battle of Stalingrad, where the enemy wears themselves out attacking a major fortress, and the Russians take advantage of their weakened positions and go on a major counteroffensive. It's easier to destroy the enemy's military when they come out of their major stronghold rather than attacking them while they're inside of them. This has essentially led to a game of reverse chicken, where neither side really wants to attack the other first. It will be interesting to see which side is the first to blink here. And with that, we have finished all of the major fronts in the Ukraine war. But there are a few other things we should look at here, and one of them is the fact that the Russians have been attacking Ukraine's entire energy grid and their infrastructure in general. And because of all of these strikes, the Ukrainians are experiencing rolling blackouts throughout the whole country. This obviously disrupts logistics and benefits the Russians' negotiating position, but there is speculation that this is in preparation for something bigger. The Russians have been sending troops and equipment into Belarus, north of Kiev. The theory is that when Russia's mobilized troops are available, they will make another attempt at Kiev. If they go all in trying to capture the city, it will be a move to try to end the war as soon as possible. But taking the capital city would be pretty difficult, so there is speculation that this might be a feint for the Russians to attack near the Ukrainian-Polish border. The goal here would be to move all the way down to Romania and over to Moldova. This would be to stop the Western supply of weapons to Ukraine and essentially starve them out. And while this would be pretty risky going so far behind enemy lines, there would be practically no troops over here, as all of the troops would be on the front line and focused on defending the capital city. It would still be pretty difficult to capture Lviv in the end, considering how massive the city is, but they might just bypass it and try to capture Ivano-Frankenstein here, and from there move on to Chervenivsky. At this point they would be very close to the border with Transnistria, which is considered Russian territory by the Russians. At this point the Ukrainians would only have 2 supply routes in the south of Odessa, but with a land bridge to Transnistria in the north, they would be able to bombard this road with artillery, and the Russians have already been bombarding this bridge to Odessa from the sea. If the Russians go for this move and are able to hold it for any significant period of time, it will essentially dry up the Ukrainians and they will be forced to go to the negotiating table. Some have argued that these mobilized troops won't help the Russians because they're not as well trained as the ones already in the fight. But the only people qualified for mobilization were people who were in the military reserves, who have had combat experience in either like Syria or Africa with Wagner, and they have specialized military training of some sort, like in artillery or infantry. The 3 months' time they're taking to actually deploy in Ukraine is really more of a refresher course to make sure they're up to speed and get them back into the swing of things if they face combat. Which that's another thing. Most of these mobilized troops aren't actually going to go to the front line. Most of them are just going to be posted in the rear of Russian-controlled territory, which would free up the Russian troops that are currently residing there, who are more familiar with combat in Ukraine, to go to the front lines. So coming back to the question of who is winning this war, it's less about who is winning right now and more about who is more likely to win in the end. Because if we look at the front line, the Ukrainians are not making any progress in Kharkiv now. The Russians are making small but important gains in Donetsk. The Ukrainians are building up for an assault in Zaporizhia, but that is where most of the Russian troops are, and even the government of Ukraine acknowledges that Kherson is a trap for them. This along with the fact that Ukraine's entire infrastructure, both energy and water supply, is crumbling by the day, and Russia will increase its forces with more mobilized being freed up over time. On top of this, winter is coming, and the Ukrainian and Polish troops are not as well prepared for such an environment as the Russians are, and the Russians have historically done their best in the winter, including in this war. With all of this put together, it's pretty clear to me that the Russians are likely to win in the end, or at least get most of what they want in negotiations. But that's my take on it. What do you think about this situation? Do you agree that the wind is at the Russians' back, or am I missing something that would point to the Ukrainians winning in the end? Let me know in the comments. Thank you all very much for watching, and have a nice day.